There's an individual, a writer from many centuries ago, who has become very famous in recent years. You probably have heard the name, Nostradamus. You know, right after the disaster on 9/11, bookstores sold out of books written by Nostradamus, because people wanted to know if this disaster was actually contemplated somewhere in his writings, which he wrote many centuries ago. Now, Nostradamus wrote in a style known as quatrains. And for those who have read his prophecies, you'll find that they're usually very cryptic. In fact, they're indefinite and ambiguous and open to different interpretations depending on who is reading these prophecies. But as we begin our study this evening, I would like to share with you a prophecy which was not ambiguous, but very direct and clear. This prophecy was actually written in the year 1909 by a woman called Ellen G. White. A small, old woman who would die in about 6 years, who at this time lived in a place called Elmshaven, which is in the Napa Valley. For those who are Adventists, it's near Pacific Union College. And she wrote in Volume 9 of Testimonies for the Church some very interesting things that I would like to share with you as we begin our study this evening. Now, probably many of you have never even heard of the name Ellen White, and perhaps you're wondering who this lady was. I'm going to share with you some additional information tonight after we give this introduction, which is really, I believe, a striking example of an incredible prophecy. In Volume 9 of the Testimonies for the Church, page 11, she said this: "We are living in the time of the end." Say, well, there's nothing extraordinary about that. Anybody could have said that. "The Spirit of God is gradually but surely being withdrawn from the earth." You say, well, we can see that. Things are getting worse and worse. "The agencies of evil are combining their forces and consolidating. They are strengthening for the last great crisis. Great changes are soon to take place in our world, and the final movements will be rapid ones." I'd like to read that last part again. Great things are soon to take place in our world, and the final movements will be rapid ones. Then on page 12, she goes on to be a little bit more specific about a certain event which was going to take place long after she died. On page 12, she says, by the way, this woman professed to receive visions and dreams, and we're going to find that in the Bible this was prophesied, that there would be a prophet who would see visions and dreams in the last days. So bear with me. She says, "On one occasion, when in New York City, I was in the night season, called upon to behold buildings rising story after story toward heaven. These buildings were warranted to be fireproof, and they were erected to glorify their owners and builders." Interesting, she mentions New York City, and she mentions buildings which supposedly were fireproof. She continues saying, "Higher and still higher these buildings rose, and in them the most costly material was used. Those to whom these buildings belonged were not asking themselves, how can we best glorify God? The Lord was not in their thoughts. At the bottom of page 12, she continues saying, as these lofty buildings went up, the owners rejoiced with ambitious pride that they had money to use in gratifying self and provoking the envy of their neighbors. Much of the money that they thus invested had been obtained through exaction, through grinding down the poor. They forgot that in heaven an account of every business transaction is kept. Every unjust bill, every fraudulent act is there recorded. So I want you to imagine this scene. She's talking about New York City long before you had the Empire State Building and the huge skyscrapers that we have today. She talks about buildings being built up to the sky. The builders don't take God into account. They use their money to gratify self. And then suddenly the scene changes. On page 13, she says, the scene that next passed before me was an alarm of fire. Men looked at the lofty and supposedly fireproof buildings and said, they are perfectly safe. But these buildings were consumed as if made of pitch. The fire engines could do nothing to stay the destruction. The firemen were unable to operate the engines. Not only, they weren't even able to operate the fire trucks, is what she's saying. Now, what's even more amazing is what she speaks about as the aftermath of what she saw concerning the buildings in New York. And by the way, she could have spoken about an earthquake knocking down the buildings. She could have spoken about a hurricane knocking down the buildings, because hurricanes have hit Long Island before, New York. But she specifically mentions New York. She specifically mentions tall buildings. She specifically mentions fire consuming the buildings. And she specifically mentions that the firemen were not able even to use their equipment. Is that striking? This is not some ambiguous, indefinite quatrain written by Nostradamus. In the light of what happened on 9/11, this is a striking description. But what's even more interesting is what she says would happen as the aftermath of the buildings burning in New York. She says this: those who hold the reins of government are not able to solve the problem of moral corruption, poverty, pauperism, and increasing crime. They are struggling in vain to place business operations on a more secure basis. In other words, they cannot solve the problems of poverty, of crime, and of economic problems, such as we have been seeing. She says if these men would give more heed to the teaching of God's Word, they would find a solution of the problems that perplex them. Then she goes on to speak about turmoil and war in the world. This is after she speaks about what happened to the buildings. On page 14 she says, the world is stirred with the spirit of war. The prophecy of the 11th chapter of Daniel has nearly reached its complete fulfillment. Soon the scenes of trouble spoken of in the prophecies will take place. Then she goes on to say on page 15, soon the battle will be waged fiercely between those who serve God and those who serve Him not. How close are we to the end?